she shared the ride. He brought a rope. The man sitting in that passenger seat was a convicted felon who had walked out of a Brazilian prison 7 months earlier and never went back. A fugitive, a man with 8 prior crimes on his record, including documented violence against women. And yet, on the evening of November 1st, 2017, he was sitting next to a 22-year-old radiology student on a highway in the Brazilian interior, heading toward a stretch of road with no lighting, no witnesses, and no way out. The last message Kelly Cristina Cadamuro sent to her boyfriend was at 1923. She said she had just filled up the tank. She said everything was fine. 1 minute later, her WhatsApp showed her as online for the last time. After that, nothing. No calls answered, no messages delivered. Just silence expanding across a highway in Minas Gerais. Here is what I cannot get past. The system that was supposed to be monitoring this man failed him out into the world. No ankle bracelet, no tracking, no supervision. The state had handed him a temporary exit from prison in March of that year, and when he did not return, nobody came looking. Nobody raised an alarm. For 7 months, he moved freely. He joined rideshare groups on WhatsApp. He told women he was traveling with his wife. He was, by every indication, hunting. And the question that this case forces me to sit with is not just who killed Kelly Cadamuro. It is, how many systems had to fail simultaneously for that rope to end up in his bag on that particular November night? My name is Harrison Cross. This is the Blackout Tapes. Today, we are in the interior of São Paulo in Minas Gerais, Brazil. The year is 2017. What happened on November 1st of that year began as something entirely ordinary. A young woman offering an empty seat in her car to help cover the cost of gas on a highway she had driven dozens of times before. It ended with a body hidden in the mud beside a stream, and a country asking itself how a man with 8 criminal convictions and a history of domestic violence was allowed to walk the streets for 7 months without a single authority noticing. This episode is about Kelly Cristina Cadamuro. It is about who she was, how she was deceived, and what the investigation revealed about a murder that exposed fractures running far deeper than one criminal and one crime. Before this episode is over, I want you to understand not just what happened on that road, but what had to happen long before that night for it to be possible at all. To understand how this happened, we have to go back several years before November 1st. Back to the life Kelly had built for herself and the specific circumstances that put her on that highway. Kelly Cristina Cadamuro was 22 years old and lived in Guapiaçu, a small town in the interior of São Paulo state. She had finished her technical training in radiology. She was working 3 jobs simultaneously, a fixed position at an optical workshop in São José do Rio Preto, the nearest city of any size, freelance makeup work on weekends, and a supervised internship in her field. If that schedule sounds exhausting, it is because it was. But it was also deliberate. Kelly was not drifting. She knew exactly what she was building toward. For approximately 2.5 years, she had been in a relationship with Marcos Antonio da Silva, 28, a civil engineer. They had met online, the way a lot of young couples meet now, and their first in-person date had been at a restaurant in São José do Rio Preto. According to court records and testimony from family members, by the fall of 2017, the relationship was deep into the planning phase for a shared life. Marcos Antonio's father had donated a land plot in Minas Gerais to the couple. They had already purchased some furniture. They had opened a joint bank account that same month, November, specifically to begin the paperwork for a housing loan. They had a mattress picked out, a cooktop, a future with a floor plan. To visit Marcos Antonio, Kelly made the trip regularly between São José do Rio Preto in São Paulo and Itapajipe, a small city in the Triângulo Mineiro region of Minas Gerais, roughly a 3-hour drive. And like millions of Brazilians who navigate the financial realities of long-distance relationships and underfunded public transportation, Kelly used WhatsApp rideshare groups to split the cost of fuel and highway tolls with strangers heading in the same direction. Testimony from co-workers, including a colleague named Marcio Rogerio Angelino, who spoke to investigators during the inquiry phase, confirmed that this was not an unusual or reckless behavior. Kelly had done this many times before. Nothing had ever gone wrong. The practice was common, normalized, economically rational. The informal carpooling economy that existed in those WhatsApp groups was built on good faith, on the assumption that people are who they say they are. That assumption is the entire foundation. And it is a foundation that a man with years of experience in fraud, theft, coercion, and domestic violence knew exactly how to exploit. On September 29, 2017, Kelly posted a message in a rideshare WhatsApp group. According to records extracted from the application and reviewed by the police technical team during the criminal inquiry, the formal investigative phase in Brazil's legal system, led by a chief investigator called a delegado, in this case, Fernando Vettorazzo. The message was direct. She was traveling from Rio Preto to Itapajipe on Wednesday, November 1st, departing at 1800 hours. She was offering seats. Jonathan Pereira do Prado saw that message. According to the confession he later gave to police, and I want to be very clear that what follows is based on his own statements to authorities, corroborated by forensic and surveillance evidence. Prado joined that rideshare group with a premeditated purpose. He was not looking for a ride. He was looking for a target, according to the investigation conducted by Delegado Bruno Giovannini de Paula, the lead investigator assigned to the case after the body was found. The technical police team rejected the hypothesis that this crime was opportunistic or impulsive. The planning was established before any contact was made with Kelly. The evidence they pointed to: Prado had a thick rope in his backpack when he got into that car. He brought it from home. That detail has stayed with me throughout every piece of documentation I have reviewed on this case. You do not pack a rope for a 3-hour ride. That rope was the plan. Prado was 33 years old. His criminal record, which the police had in full, listed 8 separate offenses: theft, robbery, fraud, extortion, threats, domestic violence under the Maria da Penha law, Brazil's landmark legislation protecting women from gender-based violence, the Brazilian equivalent of a domestic abuse flag on a criminal file, misappropriation of assets, and use of counterfeit currency. That domestic violence entry is significant. It tells investigators something specific about prior behavior toward women. It is not a minor annotation. And yet this man had been granted a temporary prison release in March of 2017 through a provision of the Lei de Execução Penal, Brazil's prison execution law, the statute that governs how sentences are served and how inmates can earn supervised freedoms while transitioning toward release. The provision in question, known colloquially as saidinha, meaning a short exit, allows eligible inmates in semi-open regime to leave the facility temporarily for purposes of family reintegration. When Prado failed to return by the stipulated date, he became a fugitive. No electronic monitoring had been required as a condition of the release, no GPS ankle bracelet, no system that would have shown the state exactly where he was going. For 7 months after that, he was invisible to every official apparatus that should have been tracking him. To get Kelly to agree to the ride, Prado used a tactic that investigators and the prosecution later identified as a deliberate psychological maneuver. He did not contact her as a single man traveling alone. He told her, through WhatsApp messages and phone calls, that the seat would be used by a couple, that he would be accompanied by his wife or girlfriend for the entire trip. Marcos Antonio, Kelly's boyfriend, told investigators that Kelly had no photograph of the passenger. The arrangements had been made primarily through phone calls, and during those calls, a female voice was apparently involved in the negotiation. either a real woman participating in the planning, or Prado himself mediating to create that impression. This is one of the open threads in the investigation that the family never accepted as fully resolved. I will come back to that. The psychological logic of the deception is not subtle, but it is effective. A woman agreeing to share a long highway drive with a male stranger carries a natural assessment of risk. The presence of another woman in the vehicle changes that calculation almost automatically. It is a mechanism of social reassurance, and it worked. Kelly agreed to the ride. On the afternoon of November 1st, Marcos Antonio sent her a text message. Court records show he used the word cuidado, be careful. He already knew the companion's setup. Something about the arrangement bothered him enough to say it. That is the kind of detail that does not leave you. At approximately 1800 hours on November 1st, Kelly arrived at the meeting point, the Praça Cívica, the main civic square in the center of São José do Rio Preto. Jonathan Prado was there. His wife was not. He told Kelly the woman had cancelled at the last minute, a sudden change of plans. He pressed to continue with the journey anyway. According to his later confession and the reconstruction by investigators, Kelly was placed in an acutely uncomfortable social position. She had made a commitment, the departure time was upon her, and the man standing in front of her was insisting with the kind of calm urgency that is hard to push back against in a parking lot at dusk. She let him in. At 18:35, she sent Marcos Antonio a WhatsApp message informing him that the woman had backed out and that she was traveling alone with the man. Court records show that this message was sent from her device and received on his. At 19:15, surveillance footage from a gas station on the BR-153, a major federal highway connecting the interior of São Paulo to Minas Gerais, in the town of Nova Granada, captured the vehicle stopping. Kelly went inside the convenience store. Prado stayed outside and was seen on camera speaking with a fuel attendant. The interaction was brief. There is nothing in the available footage that indicates alarm at that moment. Two people at a gas station. Everything looks like an ordinary stop. At 19:23, Kelly sent her last active message to Marcos Antonio. She told him she had refueled. She was continuing the trip. At 19:24, her WhatsApp status showed her as online for the final time. After that point, the application logs show no further activity from her account. Marcos Antonio tried to reach her repeatedly through the evening. Messages stopped being delivered. Calls went unanswered. By 2023, according to his own account to police, the silence had become unbearable. Toll booth cameras operated by the highway concession company in Minas Gerais recorded the vehicle crossing into the state that evening. The footage confirmed that Kelly was still driving and Prado was in the passenger seat. Approximately 2 hours later, those same cameras recorded the vehicle passing in the opposite direction. This time, only one silhouette was visible in the front seat, the driver heading back to São Paulo. According to Prado's confession, delivered to Delegado Bruno Giovannini de Paula and reviewed subsequently by Delegado Fernando Vettorazzo, the assault occurred after the vehicle entered Minas Gerais territory. He waited for a section of highway with low traffic, no streetlights, and distance from any populated area. He asked Kelly to pull over, claiming he needed to urinate. She stopped the car. At that moment, the confession states, he announced the robbery and began striking her. Facial blows, head blows. According to the forensic report from the Instituto Médico Legal in Frutal, the state-run forensic medical institute responsible for autopsies and physical evidence analysis. The evidence on Kelly's body was consistent with an intense struggle inside the vehicle. She fought. The records indicate she fought hard enough to open the driver's side door in an attempt to get out. The seatbelt locked and held her in place. Prado overpowered her through sheer physical force. He strangled her until she lost consciousness. Then he removed the rope from his backpack and used it to bind her arms behind her back. He dragged her body approximately 30 meters through riverside vegetation to the banks of the Ribeirão Marimbondo, a waterway bordered by sugarcane fields belonging to a local mill situated between the municipalities of Frutal and Itapagaipé. He left her there with her head submerged in the water. The IML's official death certificate listed the cause of death as asphyxia and strangulation. When officers from the Policia Militar, the uniformed state military police, the branch responsible for patrol and first response, located the body on the afternoon of November 2nd, Kelly was found in a state of partial undress, wearing only her top. Her pants were missing from the scene. According to the official investigation records, her pants were found discarded approximately 3 kilometers away from where her body had been left. The Ministério Público de Minas Gerais, the State Prosecution Office, the Brazilian equivalent of the District Attorney's Office, under prosecutor Fabricio Costa Lopo, formally charged Prado with rape in addition to the robbery and homicide charges. Physical evidence recovered from the scene was consistent with a sexual crime, though the prolonged contact of the body with soil, mud, and water had complicated the laboratory analysis. Prado denied the rape throughout the entire judicial process. Prosecutor Lopo addressed this denial directly in the documentation I reviewed. He argued it was not motivated by remorse, but by terror of the violent retaliation that Brazilian prison factions systematically carry out against inmates convicted of sexual crimes. That assessment is, to me, persuasive, because what happened to Prado in the first 24 hours of his incarceration supports it entirely. On the night of November 3rd, 2017, police operations coordinated by Tenente Virgilio Taparo, a lieutenant in the military police, and Delegado Bruno Giovannini closed in on the northern zone of São José do Rio Preto. The investigation had moved quickly. Toll camera footage, cross-referenced with facial recognition from the Nova Granada gas station, with cell phone tower data and WhatsApp metadata, had built a tight map of Prado's movements. Jonathan Pereira. Prado was arrested in a pre-dawn operation. 2 other individuals were arrested alongside him, Wander Luiz Cunha, 34, and Daniel Teodoro da Silva, 24. Cunha was charged with receptação qualificada, qualified receipt of stolen goods, a classification under Brazilian law that carries heavier penalties when the receiver has reason to know the goods were obtained through violence. Specifically, the 4 alloy wheels removed from Kelly's car. The prosecution also accused him of fraud procedural fraud, alleging he had cleaned and obscured fingerprint evidence from the vehicle. His attorney, Marcio Roberto Ferrari, acknowledged the stolen goods charge but contested the fraud allegation. Daniel Teodoro was charged with receiving Kelly's cell phone. Kelly's car had been located on an unpaved road between São José do Rio Preto and Mirassol. It had been stripped. The 4 wheels, the stereo, the spare tire, and various electronic components had been removed and were already in the process of being moved through the informal market. All 3 men had prior police records for similar property crimes. The system of economic incentives behind a killing like this is something investigators and prosecutors rarely get to discuss at length in the press, but it matters here. A vehicle of this kind, moved through the right contacts within hours of the crime, generates immediate cash. The murder was the mechanism. The market was already in place. In the Presidio de Frutal, the local detention facility in the city of Frutal, Minas Gerais, less than a day after his arrest, Jonathan Prado was beaten inside his cell by other inmates. The injuries required emergency medical attention from a nurse at the facility, who applied bandages to lacerations around his head and face. The prison administration transferred him to protective isolation. Investigators from the Policia Civil, the civilian detective branch responsible for criminal investigations, distinct from the uniformed military police, requested that he be kept in Frutal rather than transferred to a distant facility, because they needed to conduct additional witness hearings and a formal on-site reconstruction of the crime. I find myself unable to process this sequence without a certain darkly specific feeling. The state could not find this man for 7 months while he was free and preparing to kill someone. Once he had killed someone, the state mobilized immediately to protect him from being killed by other prisoners. I am not suggesting what the outcome should have been. I'm simply noting what the failure reveals about where the energy of the system goes and where it does not. Now I want to tell you about the questions that Kelly's family refused to let go. The police investigation moved efficiently toward a single perpetrator. Jonathan Prado confessed. The forensic evidence, the cameras, the cell data, all of it converged on him as the sole executor of the crime. But the family of Kelly Cadamuro hired a criminal attorney named Jorge Argemiro de Sousa Filho to serve as assistente de acusação, a formal legal figure in the Brazilian criminal system who joins the prosecution as an independent party, able to submit evidence, cross-examine witnesses, and appeal decisions on behalf of victims' families. And what he found when he inspected the vehicle troubled him. The car had been released from the police lot about a month after the crime. When Sousa Filho examined it, he documented several things. A linear cut in the upholstery of the rear seat, the kind of mark that could indicate a blade had been used inside the vehicle. A plastic wrapper resembling a condom package found under one of the seats. Stains on the exterior driver's side door described as consistent with vomit. The family also raised a separate concern. Communication records, they said, showed that at least one phone call had been placed from Kelly's device after the time the IML established as the window of her death. A call from a blocked number. They submitted a formal request for the full telephone records of all associated lines to be examined with the goal of tracing any possible accomplice. And then there was the toll camera footage. The family engaged an independent expert to apply digital enhancement techniques, contrast filters, volumetric analysis, to the images from the Minas Gerais toll booth. They wanted to determine whether the tinted windows of Kelly's vehicle might have concealed a third person in the back seat during the outbound journey, or the return. They also pushed back on the police explanation that the female voice in the telephone negotiations had been Prado himself disguising his speech. Family members argued there were linguistic patterns in those calls inconsistent with a single male speaker and dissimulation. I'm not in a position to say whether a second or third person was present in that vehicle. The prosecution and the forensic record as presented in the criminal proceedings did not find evidence sufficient to charge anyone else with the homicide itself. But I also think this family was not simply grieving and grasping. They were looking at anomalies that the official investigation, once it had a confessor, had limited institutional motivation to fully pursue. That dynamic is not unique to Brazil. It is not unique to any country. When someone confesses and the timeline holds, the pressure to keep pulling the thread drops off. The family kept pulling. The criminal proceedings were conducted before the Vara Criminal da Comarca de Frutal, the criminal court division of the judicial district of Frutal, the equivalent of a county criminal court, presided over by Judge Luiz Gustavo Moreira. Much of the process was conducted under segredo de justiça, judicial secrecy, a formal protective order that restricts public access to proceedings in order to safeguard witnesses and preserve the integrity of ongoing evidence collection. The hearings were extensive. Among the witnesses called were Delegado Bruno Giovannini, military police officers from both São Paulo and Minas Gerais, the fuel attendant who had spoken with Prado at the Nova Granada gas station on the evening of the crime, Kelly's uncle, and Marcos Antonio da Silva, who had to sit in a courtroom and give testimony about the last messages he received from the woman he was building a house with. 2 other young women were also called to testify. These were women who had been in contact with Jonathan Prado through WhatsApp rideshare groups in the period before November 1st. They had received messages from him. They had, for various reasons, not agreed to the arrangements or had backed out before any trip took place. Their testimony was, according to prosecutor Fabricio Costalopo's account of the proceedings, foundational in establishing that Kelly was not the first name on a list. She was a selected target in what appeared to be an active and ongoing process of identification and approach. Prado had been testing vulnerability. He had been measuring who would say yes. When Jonathan Prado appeared before Judge Luis Gustavo Moreira and confronted the full weight of the evidence against him, his posture was described by Prosecutor Lopo as cold, composed, and highly articulate. He attempted to walk back portions of his original confession. He claimed that another person had been involved in the crime. In the most cynical move of the entire proceeding, he tried to implicate one of Kelly's former boyfriends. It is a tactic that requires a complete absence of shame to deploy in a room where surveillance video, cell tower data, and toll booth footage have placed you and only you in the vehicle at the time of the killing. The argument collapsed immediately. On September 19, 2018, Judge Luis Gustavo Moreira sentenced Jonathan Pereira do Prado to more than 45 years of incarceration in a closed regime. The charges that resulted in conviction included latrocínio, the Brazilian legal classification for robbery, followed by death, which carries heavier sentencing than homicide alone because it links the killing directly to the property crime. Rape, procedural fraud, and concealment of a corpse. Kelly's uncle, speaking to reporters outside the courthouse, used the word alívio. Relief. Not justice. Relief. There is a difference. In the days after Kelly's body was found, something happened on social media that is worth understanding as part of this story. Before the funeral, before the arrest, before anyone had a complete picture of what had occurred, a wave of commentary spread through the same WhatsApp networks and Facebook pages that Kelly had used to organize her trips. Much of it blamed her. Users questioned the decision to give a ride to a stranger, suggested that her behavior had been imprudent, implied that what happened to her was a predictable consequence of the choices she had made. I want to be direct about what that is. It is a cognitive defense mechanism, and it functions as a form of moral cowardice. If the victim did something you would not do, then the violence becomes something that could not happen to you. If she was imprudent and you are careful, you are safe. The problem is that Kelly Katamuro was not imprudent by any reasonable standard, says she had done the same thing dozens of times. She requested a couple, not a single male traveler. She sent location updates. She kept her boyfriend informed. She was doing everything right. She was deceived by a man with specialized criminal expertise in deception, who had been released into the world by an institution that had not equipped itself to monitor him. The response from the community around Frutal was different. On November 5th, the Sunday following the discovery of her body, a group of residents organized a vigil at the main church square in the center of Frutal. The organizer, a local resident named Luciano Alawan, coordinated the event with support from religious missions in the area. Dozens of people gathered. They formed a procession and walked a symbolic portion of the highway route toward Itapajipe, the road Kelly had been trying to reach. The explicit purpose of the vigil, as stated by its organizers, was to contest the narrative circulating online and to restore Kelly's memory as a person of good faith and community spirit. The family could not attend. They were still in the depths of acute grief, but they received the gesture. Marcos Antonio spoke to the press in those days. It cannot go unpunished. He was not speaking only about the sentence. He was speaking about the system that had made it possible. In early November of 2017, the case was invoked explicitly on the floor of the Câmara dos Deputados, Brazil's lower house of Congress, the equivalent of the House of Representatives, in Brasilia. Parliamentary records from the session of November 7th capture speeches demanding legislative reform to the Lei de Execução Penal. Representatives argued that the temporary release mechanism, the saidinha, the short supervised exit designed for social reintegration, had been applied without adequate criminological screening, without psychiatric risk assessment, and without electronic monitoring requirements for individuals with histories of violent crime. The argument, reduced to its core, the state cannot give a man with 8 criminal entries, including robbery and domestic violence, an unsupervised exit from a semi-open prison regime, watch him disappear, and then treat that disappearance as a paperwork problem. In Jonathan Prado's case, the absence of mandatory GPS ankle monitoring was not a technical gap. It was a policy choice that had direct consequences for Kelly Kadamuro. I do not think the politicians who invoked this case on the floor of Congress were thinking primarily about Kelly as a person. They were thinking about her as a policy argument. That is an uncomfortable truth about the relationship between tragedy and legislation. But the underlying demand, mandatory electronic monitoring for all beneficiaries of regime transition, criminological risk evaluation before granting temporary releases to individuals with violent histories, was not wrong. The question is whether those demands produced durable change or whether they faded with the news cycle. Based on what I know about how these reforms tend to move through Brazilian legislative process, I think the answer is partial at best. My theory in this case is not a single theory about one night on a highway. It is a theory about multiple failures converging at a single point. The state released a man with a documented history of violence against women without tracking where he went. He used the freedom to rehearse a crime across months, testing rideshare groups, approaching different women, selecting his target. The deception he constructed was not improvised. It was the product of time, invisibility, and prior criminal knowledge of how trust operates and how to manufacture it. Kelly Cristina Kadamuro was 22 years old. She was working 3 jobs and saving for a house. She had picked out furniture with the man she was going to marry. She had driven that road before. She asked for a couple. She sent updates. She did everything she knew how to do. She trusted a voice on the phone, the way you do when there is no system in place to give you anything better than a voice. That trust was not her mistake. It was the void that a fugitive with months of freedom and a rope walked into. Jonathan Pereira do Prado is serving a sentence of more than 45 years in a closed regime in Minas Gerais. Wanda Luiz Cunha and Daniel Teodoro da Silva faced separate judicial proceedings for their roles in the reception of stolen goods. In September of 2018, the third criminal panel of the Tribunal de Justiça de Minas Gerais, the State Appeals Court, granted a habeas corpus petition to one of the co-defendants, ordering his immediate release. The vehicle thieves and the man who killed the vehicle's owner moved through the legal system at different speeds, with different outcomes, in different courts. The questions raised by Kelly's family about the toll booth footage, the post-mortem phone activity, and the physical evidence in the vehicle were not, as far as the public record shows, definitively resolved by the official investigation. The prosecution built its case around Prado as sole executioner, and the evidence supported that framing. Whether it was the complete picture remains, in the family's view, an open matter. Kelly Cristina Kadamuro is buried in Guapiaçu, São Paulo, the town where she grew up. She had graduated from technical school, was working 3 jobs, and had a plot of donated land waiting for a house to be built on it. She liked doing makeup on weekends. She knew a road well enough to feel safe on it. Her last message home said she had filled up the tank. She was on her way. This has been the Blackout Tapes. I'm Harrison Cross.